boss going to come? Maybe.
Notes say the subcommittee will come to order, but it's already in order. Members present will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the official hearing of the record. Without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 5 calendar days to allow statements, questions, extraneous material for the record to be subject to the length limitation in the committee rules. We will be joined at various points by members of Congress who are not members of the full committee or the subcommittee, but have a deep interest in the issues before us. I will recognize the ranking member for his 5-minute opening statement, after which I will give mine, and then we'll hear from the witnesses.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity to do this, and I appreciate you having this important hearing on human rights in Southeast Asia, a regional outlook. Good morning, and I'd like to thank Chairman Sherman for holding this. I should have started with my notes. I would also like to thank our esteemed witnesses for being here this morning, including Olivia Enos from the Heritage Foundation, Francisco Bencosme from Amnesty International, Dr. Cindy Wang from Refugees International, and somebody I've grown to know over the course of the last year, Miss Helen Wynn, wife of Michael Wynn. I'd like to especially welcome Mrs. Wynn, whose story I have followed for about a year. Her husband, Michael, has been imprisoned in Vietnam since July 2018 and was recently sentenced to 20 years in prison for activity against the people's government. Ms. Wynn has been working tirelessly with members of this Congress and the past Congress, the administration, the consulate in Vietnam to ensure that there is justice for her husband. And we look forward to continue this work on this important matter and this unfortunate incident to return Michael to his family, to his wife, and to his 4 children. My thoughts are with you and the family, and we're going to continue to work with the Vietnamese government. As we continue to witness decaying human rights in the region, especially in countries like Burma, Cambodia, Thailand, some in Vietnam and the Philippines, it is important that the United States and our allies stand up for the rights and freedoms of the people of this region. The world is dividing like we've never seen before. There's been a stability since World War II, if you can believe that, with much conflict that's going on. But the democracy that's led freedom, democracy, individual rights, has been unprecedented in the world, but it's being challenged today. Hunson, Cambodia's strongman prime minister, has clung to power for decades and has no intentions of relinquishing power. His regime has used violence, threats, and sham prosecutions to attack the peaceful opposition. Hun Sen's relentless consolidation of power means that his abuses, which also include attacks against NGOs and the shuttering of critical media outlets, will only continue left unchallenged. Just last week, the Cambodia Democracy Act, which we are the sponsors of, which I introduced, passed the House with wide bipartisan support. It's working its way through the Senate. We look forward to being signed into legislation this year. This legislation directs the President to impose sanctions on high-level government officials who are responsible for undermining democracies in Cambodia, including acts that are considered serious human rights violations. I look forward to seeing this bill move through the Senate and eventually become law, and I truly believe that will happen this Congress, allowing the U.S. to finally hold Hun Sen and his despicable regime accountable. Similar abuses have occurred in Burma, where an estimated 1 million Rohingya, a predominantly Muslim ethnic minority, have fled to neighboring Bangladesh to escape attacks from the Burmese military. For decades, there has been allegations of human rights violation in Burma, including murder of civilians, torture, forced labor, and the enlistment of children soldiers, which the International Criminal Court and the U.S. State Department have recently begun investigation into. Burma has also been classified as a Tier 3 country in the State Department 2019 Trafficking in Human Persons Report. That's slavery, people. That's modern-day slavery, and they're Tier 3, which is the lowest of the low that you can go. And to be clear, this is the lowest tier can be assigned. The human rights situation is poor and will continue to worsen unless measures are taken to protect the rights of the Burmese people and mitigate the devastating violence that has ravaged this country. Whether it be Vietnam's recently enacted crypto security law that oppresses criticism and opposition of the government, I think we can thank the Chinese for that, extrajudicial killings in the Philippines, or rampant human trafficking in Thailand and elsewhere, these abuses are serious and continue to threaten the peace and stability of the entire region. I look forward to hearing our witnesses today, and we explore the severity and continuation of human rights abuses in Southeast Asia and discuss ways in which the U.S. and our allies can stand up for the rights and freedoms of the people, not just of Southeast Asia, but where this is happening around the world. I look forward to this meeting, Mr. Chairman. Thank you again for holding this.
Thank you, Mr. Yoho. I'll be recognizing other members who wish to give an opening statement for either 1 or 2 minutes at their request. Now recognize myself for 5 minutes. In recent years, the United States has really ramped up our economic and security arrangements with the countries of Southeast Asia, but we must also ramp up our engagement on human rights. We played, speaking first of Burma, Myanmar, we played, I think, an important role in the return to some form of democracy and the return of Aung San Suu Kyi to a high post in Burma, where she, in effect, is the civilian president. The response, though, unfortunately, has been disappointing from even the civilian government in Myanmar, Burma, in reaction to the Burmese military 2 years ago launching what is called a military operation, one could call it an ethnic cleansing operation, against the Rohingya in Rakhine State. I want to commend Bangladesh for hosting up to 1 million refugees. America has stepped forward and provided more assistance to those refugees than any other outside country. But the maintenance of those refugees in Bangladesh permanently is not a solution for Bangladesh. It's not a solution acceptable to the American taxpayer, and it's certainly not acceptable to the Rohingya. The United States, sometimes by jihadist enemies, is branded as anti-Muslim. Keep in mind, Muslims have been subject to ethnic cleansing and genocide in Bosnia. America responded. Kosovo, America responded. And now the Rohingya, where America is at least doing far more than the Islamic Conference. The Rohingya need to return to their homeland soon. The Burmese government needs to provide them with dignity, safety, and citizenship documents. We're told, oh, it's just the military. The civilian government can't control them. The military is not in Bangladesh. So the foreign ministry, a part of the civilian government, could be there issuing 700, 800,000, 1 million citizenship documents, whether they be passports or whether they be other documents. So people could have that as tangible proof that when they get back, they will be recognized as citizens of Burma, Myanmar. I'm a co-sponsor of the Burma Act, which would impose sanctions on those responsible for the atrocities against the Rohingya. Last week, the State Department announced travel restrictions on 4 Burmese military officials. We need to do far more. In the past, Congress and the executive branch has placed significant restrictions on Burma, but these have been listed. Keep in mind, so many of the human rights community met so often with Aung San Suu Kyi. She asked us, or at least was positive, about a whole panel of economic sanctions. These sanctions, she said they would work. They worked. She said they'd have an effect on the policy in Burma, Myanmar. They did. Now, how can she tell us not to reinstitute those same economic policies that changed the government of Burma, Myanmar for her benefit? I have been a little bit, and I want to apologize to my colleagues, I'm going to go a little long here. I've raised the specter of changing the border between Bangladesh and Myanmar, because if Burma cannot make people safe, they shouldn't govern the territory. That was, I know, an extreme, unlikely, and hopefully unnecessary change. Bangladesh's Prime Minister, of course, has said they don't want to change the border. But keep in mind, Burma, Myanmar, only once in this century has an international border been changed, and that was because of the genocide and that was being committed by Sudan. As to the Philippines, we have designated a major non-NATO ally. We've provided $150 million of foreign aid annually, but the human rights situation there is appalling. Thousands of persons, we're told it's okay because they're branded as drug offenders. They, in some cases, may be, in many cases are not, have been killed extrajudicially by authorities at pretty much the urging of President Duterte. The Philippine government has yet to hold anyone accountable for these extrajudicial killings, or at least announced a policy that they're opposed to them. The Philippines must also uphold the rights of Indigenous persons. I'm pleased, I believe we have Beverly Longed in the audience. Thank you for being here in the room today. Beverly has done so much good work and participated in recent United Nations meetings on the issue of Indigenous persons. Turning to Vietnam, we have with us Helen Wynn. Thank you for coming to testify. Ms. Wynn is a surgery room nurse for highly specialized surgeries in the southern part of the megalopolis I represent in the Orange County area. Her husband, Michael, has lived in the United States for decades. He's an exemplary citizen, a business owner, and a committed family man. In July of 2018, Michael traveled to Vietnam to visit elderly family members. He had regularly visited Vietnam, but on this trip he was detained, imprisoned, and sentenced on dubious charges to a 12-year term. My colleagues, including Ms. Wynn and Michael Wynn's Congress member Katie Porter, have repeatedly raised this issue and will continue to do so until Michael returns home. We are on the precipice of perhaps improved relations with Vietnam. American companies are looking for places to do business other than China. We are the natural geopolitical alternative to China in that region of the world. Vietnam should care about its image in the United States. Vietnam is posed to benefit from closer ties to the United States. Human rights is important to America, and it's time to bring Michael Nguyen home. Now our witnesses will speak to these issues after we hear from any member who wishes to give a short opening statement. That being the case, I want to recognize Katie Porter from California to introduce our first witness, and then I'll introduce the rest.
Chairman Sherman, thank you for holding this important hearing and for providing the opportunity for my constituent, Helen Wynn, to share her family's story. Helen's husband, Michael Wynn, has been detained in Vietnam for over a year, for allegedly acting against the government. Michael's absence has devastated his family, his wife Helen and their 4 young daughters, who are now struggling each day without him, constantly agonizing over when or if they will see him again. For the past year, Helen has been a single mom. Michael largely took care of the kids before he was detained. And as a single mom of 3 kids myself, I know and can see exactly how strong Helen is. I also know how hard this is for her, and that the human harms that Michael's continued detention are creating for Helen and for their 4 beautiful daughters. Helen is working 60 to 80 hours a week now as a surgical nurse, and another 180 hours on call every 2 weeks just to be able to make ends meet, while she's juggling childcare and transportation for her kids. She has shared with me the personal stories of how her kids are really struggling with the loss of their dad, with being unable to communicate and talk with him, and the challenges that they are facing that no child should have to feel. Michael was a devoted father and husband and a member of our Orange County community. And I want a better relationship with Vietnam. But stories like the one that Helen is going to share with you all today are a real impediment to moving that relationship forward. Helen, you have my word that I will continue to advocate for Michael's rapid return to the United States and to reunification of your family. Michael is my constituent. Michael is an American citizen, and I will be tireless on his behalf and on the behalf of your family. I look forward to hearing your story.
I'll now introduce the other 3 witnesses, and then we'll hear from Ms. Wynn and the other witnesses. Francisco Ben Cosme is the Asia-Pacific Advocacy Manager at Amnesty International. He previously served as professional staff member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the second most prestigious committee in the Congress dedicated to foreign affairs. Francisco will focus on human rights in the Philippines, but given his background, is available to answer questions on all of the Southeast Asia countries that we are focused on. Cindy Wang is Vice President of Strategic Outreach at Refugees International. She previously held senior positions at the Millennium Challenge Corporation and the State Department's Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations. She holds a PhD in anthropology from the University of California, Berkeley. And last week, Cindy was in Bangladesh, and she will provide us with important information about the Rohingya situation, but is also qualified to deal with the other countries that we're focused on here. Finally, Olivia Enos is a senior policy analyst with the Asian Studies Center at the Heritage Foundation. She focuses on human rights and national security challenges in Asia, and she will deal with all of the issues that we face in this hearing. So with that, I look forward to hearing from all the witnesses, but I especially would like to hear Helen's story. Please proceed.
My name is Helen Wynn. I am a U.S. citizen, and I have been residing in Orange County, California for over 37 years. For 19 years, I have been working at the University California Medical Center and Kaiser Hospital as a floor nurse and as a surgical a registered nurse. Michael Fong Wynn and I have been married since 2002, and we have 4 daughters together. I have served medical missions in Mexico and local Orange County since 2004. In 2016, I started to serve surgical missionary in Vietnam, helping misfortunate children with a cleft lip and cleft palate. I also play an active role in my community and churches. Over a year, I say goodbye to my husband, and I wish him a great vacation in Hong Kong and Vietnam. I expect to greet him on his flight home 3 weeks later, but I didn't expect that our initial goodbye would be the final one. I was devastated to find out through social media that he was detained by the Vietnamese government on July 7, 2018 for investigation of Article 109, which is activity against the people government. This shocking to my family. It has been overwhelming at times. Sometimes at work, I am assisting in a complex surgery, receiving phone calls from psychologists from the school. Unexpected outbursts crying at school. They need comfort, but I cannot be there. I have to choose between my patient and my family. Of course, with the title of registered nurse behind my name, I had to advocate for my patients who are defensive, laying on a surgical operating room table with their chest open for open heart surgery, or their belly is open for the kidney transplant. Definitely, I had to advocate for them. But eventually, I have to get back to the school to talk to them. On June 24th, he was sentenced for 12 years imprisonment in Vietnam, a life learning to cope with loss, and still nothing could ever prepare me to the loss of my own family. Just 12 months ago, Michael Fong was my husband, the father of my 4 daughters. Now he's gone. Imagine the emptiness, the pain one feels when they have lost someone they truly loved. Imagine the confusion and the frustration for the children whose parents one day disappear. These are the struggles shared by all the family torn apart by the actions of foreign government. My husband, like any other American prison overseas, have been denied the due process that every person is entitled to under international law. The government of the United States, a country found a principle of individual rights and liberties, should do everything possible to obtain Michael's release. The United Nations, a pioneer of international human rights law, should insist that Vietnam and all United Nations member states abide by the Universal Declarations of Human Rights. and other human rights conventions and treaties. My family would like Michael returned back to us as soon as possible. The member of Congress, the State Department, the Senate, the U.S. Consulate are my family lifeline. So please help us to get my husband and the father of my 4 daughters back. Thank you.
Thank you. So often we hear about human rights in statistics as a policy matter. Ms. Wynn, you've brought it home, and I think all of us are absolutely dedicated to the immediate return of your husband. With that, we'll go on to our next witness.
Chairman Sherman, Ranking Member Yoho, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify on this very important topic. On July 1st, while many of us were looking forward to spending July 4th with our families, the Philippines National Police raided a home of a suspected drug user and killed 3-year-old Catalin Mika Olpina during an anti-drug operation in Rizal Province. Mika would have been 4 on July 31st. Mika became the latest casualty of Philippine President Duterte's war on drugs, which has killed thousands over the past 3 years. Last month, we came out with a new report on the Philippines titled, "They Just Kill," a quote from one of the victims of the so-called war on drug. I'd like to submit the executive summary of a report for the record. In towns and cities across the Philippines, the so-called war on drugs continues. In the 3 years since President Duterte took office, thousands of poor people suspected of using or selling drugs or otherwise linked to drugs have been killed by police and unknown armed persons. While during the first year of Duterte's tenure as president, these killings were fairly well documented, they often go unreported now, contributing to a perilous normalization of extrajudicial executions, police abuses, erosion of the rule of law, and victimization of the poor in the country. According to the Philippines National Police figures, at least 6,600 drug personalities were killed in police anti-drug, an average of 6 a day. Amid constant incitement from the highest levels of governments, thousands of other drug-related killings have been committed by unknown armed persons, at least some of whom have links to the police. Despite international condemnation, the Duterte administration remains defiant. In fact, the president warned in early 2019 that the second half of his 6-year term will only be harsher, stating that the last 3 years of my term will be the most dangerous for people into drugs. The deliberate and systematic nature of the killings, which appear to have been conducted as part of a government-orchestrated attack against poor people suspected of using or selling drugs, is why Amnesty International has repeatedly said that they may amount to crimes against humanity. These extrajudicial executions in the Philippines have resulted in a high level of impunity in the country, which is also one of the main regional trends we see throughout Southeast Asia. A real accountability vacuum exists in Southeast Asia, especially when it comes to abuses committed by security forces. Each failure to investigate or bring those responsible to account reinforces the confidence of perpetrators that they are indeed above the law and can act with impunity. To date, there has been no meaningful accountability at the national level for the thousands of executions that have been carried out over the past 3 years. Since President Duterte took office and launched his anti-drug campaign, just one case of extrajudicial killing among thousands has been brought to justice. Impunity also reigns supreme in Myanmar, where the military has committed some of the gravest crimes under international law, in particular against Ringa and Rakhine State and in Kachin and Shan states in northern Myanmar. A UN fact-finding mission has called for the investigation and prosecution of crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. The prospect of meaningful justice and accountability in Myanmar is currently almost non-existent, as the Myanmar military still operates independent of civilian oversight and retains control of its own judicial processes. To date, only 7 soldiers are known to have been investigated and convicted for the crimes against the Rohingya, following a Reuters investigation into the massacre of 10 men and boys in Indian village. All 7 have now been released. Fresh violations of Rakhine State, where Amnesty International has documented military war crimes against civilians from all communities since the start of this year, and continuing violations in northern Myanmar highlight the institutionalized and systematic nature of military abuse, as well as the consequences of ongoing impunity. The second trend we're seeing is a growing climate of attack on human rights defenders. Attacks on activists, journalists, and human rights defenders have only flourished and intensified, making the realization of human rights in each of these countries all the more challenging. In the Philippines, human rights defenders, particularly women, are under attack. Senator Leila de Lima, President Duterte's most vocal critique, is enduring her third year of arbitrary detention on politically motivated charges after seeking to carry out a Senate investigation of drug-related killings. Journalist Maria Ressa, who had published in-depth reports on human rights violations committed in the so-called war on drugs, faces at least 9 politically motivated lawsuits. Christina Palabay of the Philippines human rights organization Karapatan is at risk after receiving a text message from an unidentified person that she would be killed later this year. There has been numerous death threats and members of the organization Karapatan who have been killed. Even yesterday, we received reports of another human rights lawyer who was murdered. There is an urgent need, particularly in the context of rising number of extrajudicial killings and other human rights violations, to make this a priority. Earlier this year in Indonesia, I met a human rights defender, Novel Baswedan, who was fighting anti-corruption in Indonesia when 2 years ago, he was the subject of a vile acid attack which was thrown at his face. At the time of the incident, he was investigating a high-profile case that could have possibly implicated the highest levels of law enforcement. Since then, there hasn't been anyone held accountable for the attack on him, setting back anti-corruption efforts in Indonesia. It reminded me also of human rights activist Munir, one of the most famous Indonesian human rights activists who spent his life trying to make Indonesia a more free and humane place. 15 years after his assassination, justice has not been serviced. There is yet to be full accountability for all of those allegedly involved. In Vietnam, Amnesty International has identified 128 prisoners of conscience languishing in jails, the number of which has gone up a third since we last reported it last year. 10% of these cases against those jailed stem from comments made on social media platforms such as Facebook. The final trend that I'll mention is that abusers in the region have hidden behind the mask of democracy. Elections have not been a panacea for human rights and for freedom for the people of Southeast Asia. The Thai elections that occurred in March of this year were marred by severe restrictions on freedom of expression and assembly, including the dissolution of an opposition party, media censorship, legal threats, and criminal charges against candidates and peaceful protesters who brought out irregularities in the elections. Over a year after Malaysia witnessed its first change in government in 60 years, there was hope for a positive human rights transformation. However, the rise of opposition voices in response to the elections have contributed to the retention of repressive laws like the Sedition Act and backtracking on ICERD and accession to the ICC. In Cambodia, Prime Minister Hunson's party won the general elections last year, having used legislation in the judiciary to effectively eliminate any meaningful opposition and shut down dozens of media outlets in the lead up to the vote. Without a concerted effort by the United States and international community to strengthen human rights protection in Southeast Asia, the hardliners who loom large in the region are set to continue abusing rights and shattering human lives without consequences. Thank you.
We'll now hear from Dr. Wang.
Thank you. Chairman Sherman and distinguished members of the subcommittee, I'm honored to be here today to discuss the situation of the Rohingya people, a long-persecuted Muslim minority in Myanmar. On August 25, 2017, the Myanmar military began a campaign of mass violence that led more than 700,000 Rohingya to flee to Bangladesh. By September 5th, Refugees International reported that the military was responsible for crimes against humanity, a conclusion later echoed by a UN expert group and many others. Crimes against humanity do not emerge overnight. Waves of violence and displacement over decades reflect Myanmar's systematic campaign to persecute and exclude the Rohingya. Last week, I visited the camps in Bangladesh where 3 themes emerged. First, refugees want to return to their homes in Myanmar's Rakhine State, where 500 to 600,000 Rohingya remain. But the conditions there are actually getting worse. Fighting between an ethnic Rakhine armed group and the military has led to crackdowns and an internet blackout since late June. This is a warning sign of potential atrocities and is hampering humanitarian relief in Rohingya and other communities. 126,600 Rohingya live in camps for internally displaced people that are essentially open-air prisons. The Myanmar government has closed some, but with only superficial changes. For example, moving people to structures next to the camps without improving their freedom to move or access to livelihoods. The most fundamental challenge that the chairman recognized remains the denial of citizenship to Rohingya. The Myanmar government continues a documentation process that is irredeemably flawed because it is based on the 1982 citizenship law that requires Rohingya to renounce their identity as a distinct ethnic group. Given the authorities' characterization of the Rohingya as, quote, Bengali immigrants, it is no surprise that Rohingya have little to no confidence that the process could lead to equal rights and full citizenship. Earlier this year, Refugees International advocates spoke with Nurjan, a 70-year-old Rohingya grandmother whose house was burned to the ground in August 2017. She then moved to 4 different villages in Rakhine. She described security forces coming almost every night to the villages, taking men for forced labor or women to be sexually assaulted. After fleeing to Bangladesh, she says she can finally sleep at night. This leads me to the second theme. Humanitarian conditions are improving in Bangladesh, where more than 1 million Rohingya have sought safety, but more progress is needed. I saw how monsoon season poses access and safety challenges and how some food, health, nutrition, and protection needs remain unmet, especially among women and girls. As displacement continues, there's an increasing need for education, skills development, and livelihoods for refugees and their host communities. I saw home gardens, small shops, training programs that are a testament of the potential for the Rohingya to contribute to the local economy. In the immediate term, we are very concerned about Bangladesh's plan to relocate 100,000 Rohingya to Bhasanchar, a small island in the Bay of Bengal. In light of unanswered questions on safety, services, and movement to and from the island, the government should refrain from relocating Rohingya there. Third and finally, I heard that Rohingya are looking to the United States for our leadership. We recommend that the U.S. forge a 3-pillar plan spearheaded by a high-level envoy committed to sustained diplomatic engagement. The first pillar is increasing international pressure on Myanmar toward justice, accountability, and conditions for return. This would include the U.S. making a determination based on its 2018 report as to whether the abuses amount to crimes against humanity and genocide. And while we do welcome the recent travel sanctions on 4 military leaders, the U.S. should impose financial sanctions on military officials and military-owned enterprises. Congress should continue to pursue the bipartisan Burma Act, which includes sanctions and limits on security assistance. And the U.S. should lead a diplomatic effort to press for an ad hoc tribunal or referral to the International Criminal Court and implementation of the Rakhine Advisory Commission's recommendations. The second pillar is ensuring Rohingya participation throughout the response in Bangladesh and in all regional and global forums. The third pillar is for the U.S. to maintain and increase its support for Bangladesh and lead dialogue toward policy shifts on freedom of movement, education, and livelihoods for refugees. By pursuing this plan, America can advance Rohingya rights, promote regional stability, and send a critical message about our values and our priorities. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and no one in Burma, Myanmar should think that the solution is bigger and nicer refugee camps in Bangladesh. The solution is for people to go back to their homes. Ms. Enos.
Chairman and distinguished members of the subcommittee, the Trump administration inaugurated the Free and Open Indo-Pacific Strategy in 2017. There are several notable features of the Indo-Pacific strategy, including that it identifies South Asia, especially India, as falling under the purview of U.S. strategy toward Asia. The second most notable feature of the strategy are the two modifiers affixed to it, both of which relate to promoting values. The Indo-Pacific strategy makes explicit commitments to promoting human rights, democracy, and freedom. As the strategy has taken shape, however, only the security and, to some extent, the economic aspects of U.S. commitments in the Indo-Pacific materialized. The values component did not. In Southeast Asia, the U.S. has the opportunity to turn its rhetorical commitments to values into reality. There are few countries in Asia with worse human rights track records than Burma or Cambodia. These two countries provide an excellent opportunity for the administration to put rhetorical commitments to the test. Throughout the remainder of my testimony, I want to take stock of what the U.S. has done so far in Cambodia and Burma. Then I want to discuss how the U.S. can demonstrate its commitments to values in the Indo-Pacific by prioritizing the promotion of human rights in both countries. First, Cambodia. It is difficult to describe Cambodia as a democracy today. July 2018 elections, neither free nor fair, solidified Cambodia's descent into one-party rule. Sham 2018 elections came on the heels of the Cambodian Supreme Court's decision to dissolve the main opposition Cambodia National Rescue Party, CNRP, in November 2017, and the opposition's dissolution happened right after the arrest of opposition leader Kem Sokha in September 2017. He remains under house arrest today. In addition to political upheaval, concerns have deepened regarding China's influence in Cambodia. Recent reports indicate that China signed a secret naval base sharing agreement that gives China exclusive rights to part of a Cambodian naval installation on the Gulf of Thailand. The alleged base sharing agreement could amplify the threat that China poses to freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. While the U.S. responded to Kem Sokha's arrest and the dissolving of the CNRP with strong statements and eventually by imposing travel restrictions on Cambodian government officials, it has done little to respond after July 2018 elections. The U.S. government promised that there would be follow-on actions, presumably sanctions, but now, more than a year after failed 2018 elections, no further sanctions have been issued. The U.S. should view Cambodia as a battleground for values, perhaps even as a litmus test for whether Southeast Asia is trending more toward democracy or authoritarianism. Now I want to turn to Burma. Horrific events of August 2017 resulted in the displacement of approximately 750,000 of Burma's Muslim minority Rohingya. The United Nations fact-finding mission report found evidence that genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes took place. Conservative estimates suggest that more than 10,000 Rohingya were killed, with many more women and girls sexually abused or raped. There were even horrifying reports of mothers having their babies torn from their arms and thrown into the fire right before their eyes. In spite of overwhelming evidence documenting the genocide, and several reputable institutions, including the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, corroborating, the U.S. government has not issued a determination on atrocities committed against the Rohingya. This is in spite of the fact that the Secretary of State has the authority to issue a genocide determination at any point in time. In fairness, the U.S. has already provided $494 million in aid, making it the top provider of humanitarian assistance to Burma and Bangladesh. The U.S. also already issued global Magnitsky sanctions against some members of the Burmese military, and just last week imposed travel restrictions on others, including Senior General Min Aung Hlaing. The U.S. government, however, stopped short of financially sanctioning Min Aung Hlaing and some of the other military officials who bear primary responsibility for atrocities. In the face of such severe crimes, I would point the distinguished members of this subcommittee to my written statement submitted for the record, which has additional recommendations. But for now, I will offer 5. The U.S. government should first appoint an interagency coordinator responsible for promoting human rights and values in the Indo-Pacific strategy. Second, it should sanction Hunson and other party cadres for undermining democracy in Cambodia. Third, it should create and convene an emergency meeting of the Cambodia Contact Group comprised of the parties to the 1991 Paris Peace Agreement who have an obligation to hold the country accountable if democracy falters. Fourth, they should financially sanction senior members of the Burmese military, particularly Min Aung Hlaing, for the crimes they committed against Rohingya. And fifth, the U.S. government should make an official, public legal determination on crimes committed against Rohingya. The U.S. has intermittently viewed human rights as a luxury issue to be raised when all other diplomatic issues are addressed. But this is not the most strategic way to respond to human rights challenges in Asia. The U.S. should take these and other steps to demonstrate its tangible commitment to preserving and promoting human rights in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you, all witnesses, for your testimony. I'll now recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania for 5 minutes, and then we'll go on to Mrs. Wang.
Thank you very much to all of you guys for your testimony today. I very much appreciate your insight. My questions are for Dr. Huang. I have had the opportunity to be in Burma or Myanmar a couple of times within the last decade or two, and experienced and seen kind of firsthand what you're talking about. My questions have to do, though, with what's happening in the camps particularly, and some of the concerns I have specifically for women and girls and the conditions that they're in, sexual assault, a lot of other issues that are very alarming to me. And I was wondering if you could give us any guidance of what could be done to be more helpful in that area, what we can do to be more helpful in that area.
Thank you so much for the question, and I do also want to reaffirm Chairman Sherman's comment at the outset that ultimately the sustainable solution is repatriation and conditions for return. Unfortunately, these do not exist today. And so moving to the camps, yeah, it was really a devastating situation, and there continue to be, according to the United Nations, almost 7,000 women who remain extremely vulnerable to sexual and gender-based violence. And so some areas, and Refugees International released a report last year with a set of recommendations on what more we can do. So first and foremost is to continue to resource the SGBV and other response that is happening in the camps. And right now, the limitation is not the number of structures, but really the capacity, the human capacity, the trained midwives, the staffing, and also the referral pathways, so that when someone comes with an issue, that they are able to be referred to a variety of services, whether they're health, legal, or other. Secondly, I think some of the recent trouble that women have been having has been around the fact that they are volunteering with NGOs, or able to engage in small activities. And so I think there the response is we must continue to provide those opportunities for women, but also that to have a holistic view and make sure that the entire family has a way to engage. And so I think with these measures, and then obviously on just the diplomatic front, to continue keeping an eye on the situation, continuing the congressional delegation so that these issues remain elevated.
Thank you. And I have a second question as well for you. I'm also coincidentally a daughter of a refugee myself, and my dad really raised me to believe in the power and importance of education. In the camps themselves, is there any opportunity for education of any form for the children or adults?
Right. Recently, the Bangladesh government approved the first few levels of a learning framework for children. It is still an informal education, so there's a lot. They are able to access some. One of the things that I heard in the camps last week is that, most children are only getting about 2 hours of instruction a day, and that's not due to any regulation. That's a space constraint. They're putting several shifts of kids into the school, so I think to address this, we should continue to push for a learning framework that can lead to certification. And I heard from refugees that there's a lot of interest in getting the Myanmar curriculum approved for use in Bangladesh. And the reason is people want to learn a language because they do anticipate returning home. I do think it seems so practical and basic, but space is a big constraint. And I want to recognize that Bangladesh has a high population density, so space is not easy to find, but there are other ways. I think some additional space for health clinics and education centers would be helpful, and they're also exploring the opportunity to create 2-floor structures, which would also help to relieve some constraints.
Thank you. And my very last question with my remaining 52 seconds also for you, Doctor, is are there any, you talked a little bit briefly, I think, about job prospects or opportunities for work. What kinds of opportunities are there? Is there also anything that we can be doing to be more helpful there as well?
Right now, the work opportunities are limited to cash for work, so refugees who help pave the roads or build structures in the camps, but there are some training programs. For example, I got to visit a workshop where women are learning how to sew so that they could potentially do more tailoring both for themselves and potentially for some work opportunities. I think that's an area where, again, unfortunately, due to the continuing conditions in Myanmar, that we should continue to engage on. And we've just learned from global experience, especially in the last 3 years, that when refugees are given that opportunity to contribute anywhere in the world, they help drive local growth, and that also can really assist with moving from the unsustainable year-on-year humanitarian aid model to an opportunity for people to live with dignity and self-reliance.
Thank you very much. My time has run out. I yield back.
Thank you. I'll now recognize the gentlelady from Missouri.
I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member for organizing this important hearing and caring so much about this issue, as we all do on foreign affairs and certainly in the Asia-Pacific Subcommittee. As co-chair of the Congressional ASEAN Caucus, I understand that Southeast Asian countries are critical U.S. partners. But I remain deeply, deeply troubled by reports of serious human rights abuses in the Philippines and Vietnam in particular, and by the ongoing genocide against Ringa Muslims. The United States must hold its friends and allies to the same high standard it holds itself. In the Philippines, Duterte has used his war on drugs to justify rampant human rights abuses, including these what he calls extrajudicial killings, and the imprisonment of opposition figures. I am especially concerned about the plight of the indigenous peoples in the Philippines. In Mindanao, which has been under martial law since May of 2017, the Duterte administration has committed these extrajudicial illegal killings, illegal arrests, and attacks on indigenous schools set up by, in partnership with NGOs. Mr. Bencosme, how can the United States work with the international community to protect indigenous peoples in the Philippines?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I think it's really incumbent on the United States to work with like-minded countries to raise this at the highest levels diplomatically. I think the fact that there is constant harassment of indigenous people as well as other human rights defenders in the Philippines is part of a larger trend where President Duterte sort of attacks most of his critics. Anything that is sort of not seen and aligned with his agenda, he either imposes, most recently, sedition charges against or tries to sort of incriminate them through the media or through various other tactics. I think the United States has a very important relationship with the Philippines, and that provides leverage for us to be able to raise these at the highest level. The fact that we just recently got an assistant secretary for East Asia. We have an ambassador who's now going to another post. We don't have an assistant secretary for DRL, are all areas where we need to have the vacancies and sort of full-time senior staff to be able to raise these issues at the highest levels.
I couldn't agree more. I understand that China is financing, they call extractive development projects, which basically means kicking people off and pillaging their land in the indigenous lands in the Philippines. Mr. Bencosme, what is China's role in shoring up the Duterte administration?
Yeah, so the Chinese and President Duterte have a schizophrenic relationship as well, in that particularly with relation to the South China Sea area that has been of intense interest of the subcommittee. What we've seen is China playing both sides of the peace process. What we've seen is China playing a role in which obviously it disregards for human rights issues in the region, and where it sort of funds a lot of these.
And pillaging their land and their minerals and the things that that the indigenous people have as assets. And
right. I mean, and so this is where President Duterte, who talks a lot about national sovereignty, is unwilling to really stand up and care about human rights or his own people inside his own country. And so it's really incumbent upon the United States to raise this at a high level.
In my limited time, thank you very much. Dr. Huang, Burma refuses to establish conditions for Rohingya refugees living in exile in Bangladesh to return to their homes, as we've discussed here. As a result, I understand that aid providers are beginning to shift towards longer-term strategies, although Bangladesh has made it clear that Rohingya settlements on its territory are temporary. Since there are no signs that it is safe for Rohingya to return to Burma in the foreseeable future, what are the long-term prospects for the Rohingya in Bangladesh?
Yeah, and just to affirm again, as you said, that Myanmar is not creating the conditions
Correct.
for return. And so I do think, and I think responders on the ground recognize that it is important to transition the response from, it is to be sitting idle and only receiving food handouts day after day, that's really the recipe for a lost generation. And so I think some of the transition that needs to happen, we spoke a little bit about education.
Right.
So right now it's just informal, but if we could make it more formal, I think that would give people hope. Then also to improve the living conditions, so both around space and the quality of housing.
So that they're not so temporary.
Right, and then, yes, and finally, I think for those livelihoods opportunities, I understand that that has to be incremental, but to create opportunities for people to fish, to create small, tailoring items so that they can become more self-reliant. And again, we've seen in other places in the world that this is a more sustainable and dignified.
And we know they want to return home, but we're going to have to
right.
look at some kind of long-term prospects. My time has expired, and I thank the chairman for his indulgence, and I yield back.
It's been brought to my attention that Mr. Levin has been here or got here early in the hearing, and I will recognize him for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to follow up on my colleague from Missouri's interest in the Rohingya situation. Dr. Huang, what aspects of American aid and other international efforts to the Rohingya in Bangladesh are working well in this difficult situation?
Yeah, I do feel we truly need to commend Bangladesh, the international community, especially the United States as the largest donor for the response. I mean, it's really boggles the mind to think about 700,000 people coming in a span of 2 months. And the fact that there hasn't been a major disease outbreak, for example, is really a sign. I think in the future people will be learning lessons about how you can mount a rapid, wasn't perfect for sure, but I think the basics around getting people food distributions, shelters in the immediate term, there have been successes there.
And how easy or difficult is it for NGOs to assist Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, and what more can the government of Bangladesh, as strained as the situation is for them, do to improve that situation?
Yeah, for a long time, Refugees International has been calling for the government to create a clear and consistent process for NGO registration because some have experienced delays and hiccups. I think clear processes around registration and project approval so that people understand what the parameters are. Of course, we want that to be a wider set of parameters so more services can be provided as well.
And can you speak to the situation of the 500,000 to 600,000 Rohingyas still living in Myanmar, including the 120,000 living in camps for internally displaced persons?
Yeah, the conditions are extremely dire, and they are not improving. With the fighting between the Rakhine and the military, there's just been further crackdowns and loss of humanitarian access, in particular in the internally displaced persons camps. The situation, despite other rhetoric, are really getting worse, not better. For example, we hear reports of people who are, as I mentioned, kind of moved to a space just next to the camp and said, okay, you're no longer in a camp, but they have no increased access to livelihoods, ability to move, ability to see their family that they're not with. So it's extremely troubling.
And who actually has access to those places? What outside groups are there, if any? You say we get reports.
Right.
From
Right
whom?
now, it's extremely limited. My understanding is that primarily it is the UN agencies such as WFP who do have access. And I think one step forward, knowing that Myanmar is not prepared to take more dramatic steps, is to increase access of NGOs, organizations like Amnesty International, so that we can have a better understanding of what's happening.
Thank you. All right, I want to move on quickly to accountability for the perpetrators of this crisis. Mr. Ben Consme, if I'm saying that right, on November 22nd, 2017, then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson stated that the situation in northern Rakhine State constitutes ethnic cleansing against the Rohingya. A State Department report released on September 24, 2018, laid out a compelling case for crimes against humanity committed by the Burmese military against the Rohingya while stopping short of a legal determination. Should the U.S. government make such a determination, and if it did, what would the impact be?
Absolutely. So we've been calling consistently for the United States to make a legal determination. The implication of such a determination is that, one, it would be a rallying cry for the international community to provide more humanitarian assistance. Second, it would set the foundation for future criminal accountability, particularly if the United States signals to other international bodies that, whether credible investigations of genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes were committed within Myanmar.
And last week's action imposing visa bans against 4 leaders of the military, how significant was that, and if it was?
So the fact that Min Aung Hlaing was named as a grave human rights violator was significant. But the JADE Act, which is still in place, already imposes visa restrictions on all of these officials. So it was really a public shaming technique. And our opinion is that they need to go further. There needs to be real criminal accountability, there needs to be real financial assistance, and there needs to be a legal determination.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, let me conclude by thanking Mr. Ben Consme and Amnesty for your work in support of my Burma Political Prisoners Assistance Act, and I'm looking forward to getting that through the full House soon. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. We have a few more people to ask questions here. I know that we haven't asked Ms. Wynn anything, but I think several of us will. I certainly will. At this point, I'll recognize the ranking member, Mr. Yoho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the panel being here. Ms. Wynn, we'll start with you. We followed that case pretty closely. There was a lot of interest here in Congress. A lot of members, different congressional districts around the country were involved in that, and it started last Congress. In the situation your husband, Michael, do you felt that he went through a fair process in Vietnam for his trial?
I was not there for the trial, so I would not be able to comment for that.
Okay. I won't go too much into it on a public platform. I guess the last time you've gotten word he's doing fair, okay?
Well, he's doing well in detention center right now, according to the message that I got from the U.S. consulate.
Okay. I'll talk to you more in private, and we can discuss more about that. I want to move on to things that I hear over and over again. Dr. Wang, you were talking about the situation you mentioned in the refugee camps. Obviously, they're less than adequate, and children are only getting education twice a day, if that, and I'm sure that's not 7 days a week. That's sporadic. Is that correct?
Yeah, 2 hours a day, right? Because people are going in different shifts.
Right.
Yeah, kids are going in different shifts.
And so we look at just that that's just with the Rohingyas we're talking about,
Yeah.
right? And I know this meeting is dealing with Southeast Asia, but if we look around the world, the amount of refugees, and then we look in our Western Hemisphere where we've got the largest exodus of people out of a country that we've ever seen, and you add that all together, we're probably pushing 80 million people, 70 to 80 million people around the world that are in refugee camps. And if there is not order and a society order with education, the things that we've all done, that we've grown up over the last couple hundred years, we are creating a hotbed of just chaos coming if we don't solve these problems. And so my question, you two are NGOs, right? So you're not directly involved so much in policy, the implementation of policies. Ms. Enos, you help direct policy. One of the questions I have is, as we see things unraveling, we see competition of democracies or alternatives to democracy, socialism with Chinese characteristics. We have to decide as democratic nations, or nations that, like ours, a republic that has a democratic process, we have to decide who we're doing business with, because our foreign policy has to change. If it doesn't change, what I've seen, I've been here 7 years, I just see more division, and we have more refugees. I propose, and I want to hear your thoughts on this, that we change our policy, not just here in our country, but with the EU and like-minded countries, to change how we trade with nations. Cambodia is claimed to be a democracy, but Hunson has bastardized that word. It is anything but a democracy. We've met with Sam Rainsy, we've met with other people from there, from the CNRP, but yet we're still doing trade with them. And I can look at several countries in Latin America, other countries that we're doing trade with. And if we really value these positions and these beliefs that we've had in this country that other Western democracies practice, I want to know how we get away from trading with these countries. Are we bold enough as nations that believe in democracies, liberties, and freedom to say, until you change what you're doing, we're not trading with you? Between us and the EU, if we use just Cambodia, we account for 65% of that country's trade. I want to know why we don't change that and just say, go to elsewhere, we are not trading with you. And I think if we stick together as like-minded countries, those countries will come around without me telling them what to do. They're going to have to make that decision internally. What are your thoughts on that?
Thank you for asking me about that. As you mentioned, the EU has already temporarily suspended the everything but arms trade status for Cambodia and is currently considering suspending that permanently.
Did you say everything but arms?
Everything but arms, that's right.
So they're trading arms with Cambodia?
Yes, it's the EBA trade agreement and framework. And so that is currently temporarily suspended. And then there is a chance in 12 months from, I think, about February or March that that will be permanently revoked. The EU is currently undertaking a process where they would consider that. And at the same time, U.S. Congress has the Cambodia Trade Act, where we are considering whether the generalized system of preferences needs to be reevaluated for Cambodia. While I think it would be really wise to look at and investigate whether or not Cambodia merits GSP preferences over the long term, I do fear that doing such a broad-based sort of trade sanction may do more harm to the Cambodian people than it does to the Cambodian government. And so I think we need to be careful about the types of policy solutions that we recommend. This is one of the reasons why Heritage has been very vocal in terms of advocating for the use of global Magnitsky sanctions, which would enable us to go against Hunson directly and other party cadres who are directly responsible for undermining democracy there.
Well, and I just want to let you know that the Cambodia Democracy Act, as you know, passed here.
Of course.
We are working it through the Senate, and we look forward to having that signed this year. So it's another tool that we can put on a despotic leader of a nation that shouldn't be there. He should put his people ahead of his own personal pleasure or wealth. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Now recognize the gentlewoman from Nevada.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will continue kind of that line of questioning. You know, in the past, the U.S. has often overlooked civil rights abuses in countries when we are trying to have alliances that support our national security. And now that seems to be the case in Southeast Asia. You mentioned, Ms. Enos, about the problems in the Indo-Pacific strategy. Our strategy is getting more specific on the security aspects, and there are some economic things that have been done, but it's pretty silent on what the human rights aspects are. We have declared Vietnam as a key partner because we want their help in a free and open relationship to kind of counter the Chinese influence in the area. The Cambodian situation is maybe a little bit different, but what can we be doing, all three of you, to kind of step up our attempts to balance support for human rights with the need to counter Chinese influence? And do you think this administration is doing enough of that?
I'll take that first. So I think that the administration has made a lot of rhetorical commitments through the Indo-Pacific strategy to human rights, but we have not seen the actual strategy itself materialize. And I think that there is, not just in this administration, but in several preceding administrations, an unnatural divorce between national security and national interest priorities and human rights, when I think in reality, adopting policies that advance human rights principles have the potential to advance U.S. national interests as well. And so I think we need to do a better job of articulating what that looks like.
Right
and
now, we haven't even seen the full report, and we don't even know who's in charge, I believe, who's responsible for articulating this kind of policy. I mean, we've seen it in Latin America, you see it in Saudi Arabia. We just don't, you're right, we haven't married the two. Doctor, would you add to that? Or?
I'll limit my thoughts to Myanmar, but I think that's a great case example, and I think that there are always many interests to balance, but in the case of Myanmar and potentially others, we're talking about the most serious crimes that can be committed. So I think though some of the sanctions that have been discussed, for example, new sanctions that could be placed on high-level senior officials, that could be placed or reenacted on military-owned enterprises, that we must continue to stand for the facts on the ground and the fact that there is the possibility for greater accountability and justice in this situation and likely others.
I'll add that I'm not sure how you can have a free and open Indo-Pacific without free societies and ensuring that everyone within the region has the human rights that they deserve. Last year, Congress, through bipartisan and bicameral means, passed the Asia Reinsurance Initiative, which Section 4 focused on human rights and good governance, making sure that there's oversight on implementation of those provisions, particularly on helping out human rights defenders, making sure that civil society in the region has robust funding and support, making sure that there's exchanges among civil society so that there are regional lessons learned being exchanged through the different human rights activists in the regions. All of those, I think, are a couple of fantastic low-hanging fruit that the State Department could implement, but unfortunately we haven't seen any of that come to fruition.
We see a lot of concern about a rapper in Sweden, but not some of these other people who are held in places in Asia. Thank you. I'll yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. And this is for any members of the panel. We sometimes hear the argument that if we press ASEAN countries too hard on human rights, China will come in, fill the power vacuum, and advance its interests. Unfortunately, I think at least to a limited extent, there is validity in that point of view. Nonetheless, I think we should push human rights and human decency as much as possible all over the globe, and I'd just like to maybe go down the line if you could comment on that, maybe start down there. Thank you.
That's an excellent question. I think that there's been a lot of focus and concern on the extent to which China can influence countries in Southeast Asia, and that concern, of course, is merited. But I think that the reality is that all countries in Southeast Asia are going to economically engage with both the U.S. and China, and they're not going to like it if they're pressed to choose, to be totally frank. I think where we should express concern is when there is this military cooperation similar to the base sharing agreement that we see with Cambodia, the news reports emerging just this past week about some of the military cooperation that is there. But all that to say, countries in Southeast Asia are going to engage with China regardless of whether we press them on human rights. And one of the distinguishing factors of U.S. engagement in Asia historically, through our alliance relationships and otherwise, has been the promotion and commitment to freedom, democracy, human rights, and values. And I think that should remain an enduring part of U.S. strategy.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that it's important for America to lead, but not act alone. And so therefore, I think we have to double down on our partnerships with the EU, with the United Nations, with other countries in the region. I think when you add all of that up, there is a lot more progress that can be made and engagement that can be deepened in the region.
Thank you. Yes.
I wanted to add a specific case in point. I think the United States could be well-positioned with other partners to raise the human rights implications of China's Belt and Road Initiative. So it's particularly, we looked at Vietnam's in Binh Thuan province, where they received a power station by the Chinese, and where you saw thousands of locals come out in protest because of pollution and environmental issues related to the coal and fire plant. And then in March of 2019, the Vietnamese state audit came out with assessing that there was bad pollution as a result of this Chinese power plant. Where was the United States raising these human rights issues, where we could have used human rights to stand with the people of Vietnam, of this village and part of Vietnam? We should use this human rights as a comparative advantage vis-a-vis China. It's part of our U.S. national security, not something that prevents us and paralyzes us from speaking on behalf of our values.
Thank you. Did you want to comment? If not, I'll just move on.
I agree with Francisco here, so I have no further comment anything about it.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. I co-chair the House Freedom of the Press Caucus along with our colleague Adam Schiff. Would anyone like to discuss press freedom in Southeast Asia generally, and specifically, could you discuss whether ASEAN countries are adopting Chinese so-called sovereign internet tools? Yes, sir.
Happy to. One of the regional trends we're seeing is enactment of cybersecurity laws, which allow for online repression. So we're seeing this in Vietnam, where they instituted a new cybersecurity law. A couple of years ago, Thailand did the same thing. We've seen the criminalization of free speech, both online and offline. And so they're very much using the same tools that the Chinese have used and sort of using that domestically to crack down on protesters. We've obviously seen a promotion of online hate speech, and that's also a very worrying trend. And in the context of press freedom, I'll just highlight in the context of Myanmar, we've seen an intense crackdown on freedom of the press. In particular, we just saw that recently the Burmese Irrawaddy, the editor, was recently detained and was pressed charges against them. There was defamation suits against 5 people for live streaming a satirical performance mocking the Myanmar military. Coco G was detained in connection with a Facebook post critical of the military, who is also a founder of a film festival in Myanmar. These are all things that the civilian government is doing. And so while we need to focus on accountability for the Myanmar military, we should not take off our foot on the pedal with respect to raising human rights abuses with the civilian government as well.
Thank you very much. My time's expired, and I want to thank the chair and the ranking member for extending the privileges to ask questions in this committee. I appreciate it.
Thank you. With that, we'll hear from the gentlelady from Virginia, and Ms. Wynn, if I will have some questions for you. So thank you for your patience. And you may get some questions from the lady from Virginia as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to first thank Ms. Nguyen for being here today and sharing your story. I commend your strength through this incredibly difficult time, and I will continue working with Representative Porter to ensure that we see your husband's safe return. I had a number of questions related to Burma and the rampant human rights abuses occurring there and the devastating refugee crisis it has created. But I do believe that our witnesses today have given us a lot to think about on this topic, and certainly more ideas for us to pursue into the future. So I'll pivot towards the Philippines with my question. Amnesty International's 2017-18 report on the Philippines expressed concern about the, quote, deliberate, unlawful, and widespread killings of thousands of alleged drug offenders, as well as, quote, reports of increased numbers of arbitrary arrests and detention and extrajudicial executions of political activists, end quote. Human Rights Watch has also noted that in previous years it has, quote, documented the killing of numerous activist peasant leaders and labor organizers. The president of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte's Allies swept the Senate elections in May, and recent polls seem to show widespread approval for his policies, including detentions and extrajudicial killings of drug traffickers. Given these human rights abuses, how can the United States incentivize the Philippines to move away from these policies when they at least appear to be supported by a large portion of the population?
Thank you, Congresswoman. You know, it is really troubling that there still remains public support for the so-called war on drugs. I think that that's still irrelevant because Philippines made a commitment to abide by international human rights obligations. And so I think a couple of things that Congress can do. First is that there is a House Resolution 233, which speaks out against Philippines' human rights abuses, particularly in the context of crackdown on human rights defenders like Senator De Lima and Maria Ressa. Second, that there was last year introduced a Philippines Human Rights Accountability Bill that is worth re-examining whether it should be reintroduced into this Congress. And there's important provisions there that look to law enforcement, what type of law enforcement assistance that we're providing to make sure that it's not complicit in the human rights abuses that is going on with the Philippines National Police. I think the fact that the extrajudicial killings has not been raised at the highest level, which starts with our own commander-in-chief, and the fact that there's been rhetoric almost mimicking the same type of drug killings domestically and sort of lauding the President Duterte, I think is extremely concerning. And so really we need to make sure that our house here domestically is in order before we have credibility in places like the Philippines.
Thank you. Would anyone else care to comment on that question? Then from a data perspective, I would ask, have there been any fluctuations? Have we witnessed any fluctuations in the popular support for Duterte as an individual, as a politician, or in his policies? And if so, are there any specific things that we can learn from those circumstances?
I think one of the things, we just came out with a report last month, and one of the main findings was that the center of gravity on the killings actually shifted when particularly police officers were changed to a different part of the Philippines. So it's important to note that we need to hold all of those who have been responsible for these killings and sort of either condemning these killings or not stopping them to account. And so really getting at the level of impunity, I think, is at the core of how we resolve this issue. Unfortunately, we haven't seen much fluctuation with respect to public opinion on this issue.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes since I have not asked questions yet. Then we'll go on to Mr. Lowenthal, and then we'll do a second round for whoever is still here. Ms. Wynn, you mentioned, I believe, that your children and you haven't been able to have direct contact with Michael. Is that true? And have you asked the Vietnamese government for an opportunity to speak with your husband by phone or visit him?
That is correct. We haven't had any access to, to phone or receive any letter from Michael. We only, we have U.S. consulate, visit him and deliver a message from us to him, and and they deliver the message back to us from him also. Otherwise, like no direct contact. We did request, but they asked us to be present, at the detention center, be able to talk to him, but not through the phone or have him write anything to send out.
So he's not allowed to write you a letter?
No.
And they won't allow you to talk by phone, and an in-person meeting would then subject whoever goes to Vietnam to the same justice system your husband was subject to. Would you fear for your safety if you went to Vietnam at this time?
Correct. at this time, before I was not have that fear because of my medical missions. And now it's like seeing my husband detained like that, I will fear for myself, because if he already got detained and I'm gonna get detained too, then who's gonna take care of my children?
Yes, is obviously international standards would require first that you be allowed to talk to your husband by phone, that your children be allowed to talk to your husband by phone, and that perhaps you be given some form of diplomatic immunity so that you would be beyond the reach of Vietnamese law, so that you could visit your husband. Of course, this would all be unnecessary if your husband was released. Can you describe the impact on you and your kids that you can't even talk to your husband by phone?
My 4 daughters, they are very close to Michael. He daily taking care of them, and he actually, let me describe him. He's a Mr. Mom. One word, Mr. Mom. I can't even act his role either at this time. He had been acting for 2 roles, mom and dad, and I can't even imitate that from him. So the kids are very devastated, frustrations, scare, frightened, loss of sleep. Their grades have been declined from straight A student to a C student, from an AP honor class to a regular class now. They can't focus. And that's very extremely hard on them.
Well, let us hope that the Vietnamese government understands the importance to the United States of treating Michael fairly according to human law and due process. And I would assume that the Vietnamese foreign policy establishment understands the importance of the United States to Vietnam and its future. With that, let me turn briefly to Cambodia and Ms. Enos. There was a positive event with the Cambodian government last December where they sounded positive about Radio Free Asia. But in this subcommittee in the past, I've raised concern about 2 Radio Free Asia journalists who were arrested in Cambodia in 2017. Their trial begins or has begun this week. Can you comment about Cambodia's suppression of civil society and media freedoms with reference to these 2 reporters from Radio Free Asia?
Yes, I think we've been seeing a steady decline in terms of democratic freedoms there. I think today it's pretty difficult to call Cambodia a democracy, especially given the sham of the elections. And I think that one of the ways that that Hunson has continued to undermine democracy there has been essentially by eliminating the space for civil society to act. This is anywhere from human rights groups that are trying to fight human trafficking to, as you mentioned, the Radio Free Asia journalists. The Cambodia Daily was shut down for a time. There has been a systematic assault on press freedom there and on the activities of civil society members.
Thank you. In the second round, I'll ask questions about Burma, Myanmar, and the Philippines. And with that, I'll yield to the gentleman from California, Mr. Lowenthal.
Thank you, Chairman Sherman, for inviting me to participate in this hearing on human rights issues in Southeastern Asia. I'm the co-chair of the Congressional Vietnam Caucus. I've been advocating since my time in Congress now. This is my 4th term on the issue of human rights abuses in Vietnam. I've adopted several. I'm a member of the Tom Lantos, a part of the Executive Committee of the Human Rights Commission. I've adopted several prisoners of conscience. Fortunately, 3 of them have been released. But the fourth is the most venerable Thich Kwan Do, who is the Supreme Patriarch of the Unified Buddhist Church, and it's a horror that he has been under arrest. He is in his early 90s. He is a spiritual leader. He has no danger to the government, and yet the government's attempt to quash religious freedom, and he's in the center of all of that. But I want to talk about to Helen Wynn. First, I want to preface the questions by saying that for Representative Porter from your district, I don't know if she's been here, for my dear friend Representative Correa, Representative Green from Houston, my dear friend Representative Yoho, we as a group, and Representative Sherman, but we almost every week or every other week, we've been on calls with the ambassador, the consul general, of what's going on in Vietnam. This has been a very bad year and a half, as we know, what's going on. First, in terms of American citizens who have been arrested. Will Wynn was arrested, as we know, right after the demonstrations in June of 2018. Graduate student was convicted. Fortunately, shortly after that, was deported to the United States. Michael Wynn, a wonderful resident of Southern California from Representative Porter's district, was just traveling on a bus, had been visiting Vietnam over the years many times, visiting friends and family, was on a bus, I believe, from Da Nang, going to Saigon, was dragged off that bus, was arrested, Vietnamese, broke every covenant. They were supposed to tell us within 96 hours that there was an arrest. They waited 10 days. They did not for almost a year. That was in June of 2018 until 2019. They did not really inform the U.S. Embassy, the State Department, Helen, members of Congress, just what the charges were. We did not know. He received very, very little contact during this process, a horrible process. He was then sentenced after 12 years in prison. We don't know for what and why this happened, except to say that the Vietnamese government is cracking down. Word cracking makes it sound like there's a problem. There isn't. For people Americans or anybody speaking out, any public dissent, any issue, you're being arrested in Vietnam. It's a very, very difficult and bad time. And it's outrageous that Americans who have a Vietnamese background are now becoming frightened to go back to their country of their ancestors. This is unacceptable, and I join with my colleagues in supporting Chris Smith, Representative Smith's Vietnam Human Rights Act, which invokes sanctions per the Magnitsky Act, and it imposes both financial and travel restrictions on human rights abusers. We also believe that Vietnam, and as an example of what's going on here, should also be not allowed, or should be put back as a country of particular concern again because of the issues of going on. I don't have a lot of time left. I just want to ask Helen, who were you satisfied with the legal assistance that Michael received? How did he find out about it? I'm very interested. Here for a year we heard nothing about why he was being charged, who would help him. I think at the very end I'm not quite sure I understand the process by who his lawyers were. If you could just illuminate that, because I can't imagine being in a foreign country, and not having access to support services and legal services.
So when Michael detentions in Van Dang Lưu in Vietnam, he not allowed to have any lawyers to represent him. He can't, until 2 weeks before the verdict, they allow him to have lawyer. But when we search around for the lawyer, no one would want to take his case. It's because they fear for their business. They fear for their family. So we give up. So they appointed the lawyer for him. So the state appointed that lawyer for him to represent him.
Were you satisfied with the representation you received?
Well, I wasn't there to be able to tell. So I can't say, am I satisfied with the, the verdict or the trial or the lawyer, because I was not be able to attend.
Well, I just want to send my support to you, to your family, to tell you we are not going to give up. As what I mentioned will win for the example of it was only after he was convicted that we were able to get the government to deport him. We're going to do the same thing and keep fighting for Michael.
Thank you.
And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. At this point, I'll recognize a member of the full committee, Mr. Conley, and then I see the gentleman from California.
I thank
will
the
be
chairman
recognized next.
and welcome to the panel. Mr. Enos, do you believe human rights is an important part of U.S. foreign policy?
Yes.
Do you believe the United States should advocate for human rights when it can?
Yes.
Should we try to be consistent in that advocacy?
Absolutely.
Do you believe that the head of state, the president, can make a vital difference in that advocacy when he uses the bully pulpit of the presidency, either overseas or from the Oval Office, for that matter, with respect to human rights?
I think that the president should be a vocal advocate for human rights.
And conversely, when the president does not take advantage of that opportunity for advocacy, could it do harm? Could it set back the cause of human rights?
I think that the entire U.S. government needs to devote significant attention toward highlighting the severe human rights violations.
I agree, but my question had to do with the head of state, because
Yes,
he or she has a unique role. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Mr. Benscombe, am I pronouncing that right?
Ben Cosme.
Ben Cosme, sorry. You were talking earlier when I was here, and I had to run to a markup, so forgive me for having to run out, about the Philippines. Has the President of the United States, Ms. Ennis and I agree that the President has a bully pulpit, it's unique. Human rights is a very important part of U.S. foreign policy, and the President has a particularly, a unique role in advocacy with respect to human, he can make a big difference, or not. Has he made a big difference in the Philippines?
He's made concerning comments with respect to how drug offenders should be treated, which I think are not in line with international human rights standards.
Who has?
The President of the United States.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, the President of the Philippines, Mr. Duterte, has explicitly embraced vigilantism in the Philippines. Is that correct?
Correct.
And as a result, thousands of people have in fact been murdered, either at the hands of vigilantes or sanctioned police groups in the Philippines, allegedly for drug dealing. Is that correct?
Correct.
Without due process of law?
Correct.
Without going to a court?
Correct.
Without even being arrested and detained?
Correct.
And charged? By the way, is that the system we have here in the United States?
No.
Is that a system you think we ought to be advocating for?
No.
So would you say that that's a good example of a human rights issue that's pretty important?
Certainly, the President should be, using our own system and the laws and judicial system in place and use that as a model of what should happen.
And I want to go back to what your statement earlier now to put that in context. And so certainly President Trump spoke out about this terrible situation in the Philippines in blatant violation of the rule of law, international law, human rights, and has spoken out against it and tried to tell President Duterte we do not support that kind of behavior. Is that correct?
To this day, we have not seen any public comments from
We have not seen it. Would it be fair, again, keeping in light of the sort of philosophical framework Ms. Ennis and I established, would it be fair to say that by not speaking out, in fact, it sadly encourages Duterte and his vigilantes to persist, if not expand, their illegal activities and their gross violations of human rights in this respect?
Every time that we don't speak out on the issue, it greenlights other abusers to continue to act with impunity.
So, with impunity. So the president went to Hanoi, is that correct?
Correct.
Certainly he used that occasion to speak out about human rights violations, such as Michael and lots of others. In fact, 128 prisoners of conscience identified by your organization in Vietnam, increased by a third since last year. And that number has grown because of a social media crackdown by the government of Vietnam. Is that correct?
Correct.
So certainly the president used the occasion of visiting Hanoi to speak out about that.
We have not seen any public comments about the detention of prisoners of conscience or other.
You're kidding. The president did not speak out about that. Ms. Nguyen, you're shaking your head. Did you want to comment?
I agree with Francisco. I have not heard or seen, our president speak out about, human rights while he was at the summit.
Mr. Chairman, my time is up, but I do want to simply say, I believe, and I'm very grateful for Ms. Ennis's answers, I believe human rights is a cardinal, foundational part of American foreign policy and has been since the founding of this republic. We haven't always been consistent, but we aspire to something, and the world looks to us for that advocacy when people don't otherwise have surcease, they don't have succor, they don't have a remedy. But when the United States speaks, it carries weight, even with dictators. And when we choose to be silent or turn another eye in a different direction, there are victims, real victims, human beings who are going to suffer. And that is wrong. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Conley, and I'll comment that the most eloquent speeches for human rights are those that can be silent but have a real economic effect or geostrategic effect. And when I do the second round, we'll focus on actions the United States can take to push the Philippines, push Cambodia, and especially push Myanmar, Burma in the right direction. With that, we'll recognize the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Chairman Sherman and Rep. Yoho, for your invitation to be here today. I want to say it's been an honor to represent, in my time as an elected official, Little Saigon, the largest concentration of Vietnamese outside of the country of Vietnam in Orange County. And the issue of human rights, religious freedoms is a struggle that continues to be a challenge. Sadly, we've seen the government of Vietnam crack down, and I use the word crack down, on human rights, religious freedoms by arresting not only American citizens, but Vietnamese citizens as well. And Ms. Helen Wynn, thank you for being here today. We all stand with you, shoulder to shoulder, as we fight for Michael's release, an American citizen whose crime, I'm still not sure what it was that got him 12 years in prison. And I'm trying to understand the government of Vietnam and the rationale, because a few years ago, my chief of staff, Tammy Tran, went to Vietnam, and I don't think she committed any crime, yet after 2 days there, she was arrested and then deported. And her crime, I believe, was being my chief of staff and our activities in my office in terms of speaking out human rights, religious freedom. I'm trying to, as Chairman Sherman said, I'm trying to figure out how we communicate, not only to Vietnam, but other countries around the world, that if America stands for anything, we stand for human rights, religious freedom, our First Amendment, freedom of speech, and that there may be consequences for doing this. We'll continue to fight for Michael's freedom. Yet, as my colleague Mr. Lowenthal said, there have to be consequences. We'll watch, but we'll not watch patiently and silently. We'll continue to be active, remind the government of Vietnam that there may be some consequences. Trade continues to grow with Vietnam. Our military ties continue to grow with Vietnam. Yet I would pull back and tell my colleagues in Washington, we have to take a pause. At what cost? TPP may be back on the table someday, but we have to also precondition our relationships on basic respects for humans, human beings, human rights, religious freedom. Countries of particular concern, that category. I think we have to look at that, not as a threat, but really to look at other countries and say there's a certain level of behavior we're expecting of you as we continue to do trade with you, we continue to work with you militarily. And Helen, we'll continue to work together. You're not forgotten. Michael is not forgotten. And as I think about when you got your legal help, when you got your attorneys, I'm reminded that maybe there's a different legal system in Vietnam and other countries that do not respect due process the way we know due process to be. I would ask you to comment. Thank you.
I left Vietnam when I was young, so I don't know their legal system over there. So what happened to my husband, I have realized that there's no due process over there. And that is, we take advantage of what we have here. We don't value it. When it comes to in that situation, that's when we realize that, due process that we have to, value it.
And I would say that that's what I suspect to be the case. I know the case. Again, the American citizens of Vietnamese heritage that have had challenges in Vietnam are essentially those that have essentially expressed themselves, their freedom of speech, and that has caused them, in many cases, their freedom. We'll continue to watch, we'll continue to monitor, and I would ask the government of Vietnam, work with us. We're watching and we're not forgetting. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you, and I'll point out the government of Vietnam puts substantial effort into trying to encourage Americans to go visit Vietnam and be tourists and spend money. And they should be aware that Americans are also watching this hearing, that Americans turn to the State Department for advice on where they'll be safe and happy on their vacations. And I'm not sure that we can provide that kind of assurance at this point to those seeking sunny beaches and interesting historical sites. With that, I recognize the gentleman from Texas who is not a member of the committee, but is very involved in this matter.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank the ranking member, and I greatly appreciate your allowing me to interlope today and have an opportunity to give my expressions to Mrs. Wynn for her courage, for her ability to simply continue to hold on to the hope necessary to see her through what are exceedingly difficult, uncomfortable, and unimaginable times. Ms. Wynn, I'm so honored that you have this photograph of your family. My hope is that it has been picked up by our television cameras. If it has not, I would gladly have it moved such that it can be, but my hope is that it has been. I see that you have your youngest child there with you. How old is this child, please, Ms. Wynn? She was 8 then, she'll be 9. So if your husband, her father, if he's gone for 12 years, he will miss her high school graduation. He will miss 12 birthdays. What we have to do is not allow Mr. Wynn to become a number. He's a person. He has family. He has roots. He can't be a number. We refuse to allow him to be just another person who's been caught up in a system. If he is away for 12 years, my suspicion is that one of your children will probably marry. He won't be there to present his daughter's hand in marriage as we traditionally do in this country. It would not surprise me to know that the Wynn family will grow over these 12 years. He won't be there to see his first grandchild come into the world, the baby take the first step. He won't be there to congratulate children as they move on in life. They acquire jobs and they acquire lives for themselves outside of the home. He will miss some of the most important times in the lives of his family. So my appeal, Mrs. Wynn, is to the government of Vietnam to understand that a man who has no criminal record, a person of faith, a person who has been a model citizen in this country where we have laws, a person who has, for the most part, done the things that we would want a person to do to make the world a better place. That this man, he's not a number, but he's somebody special to us. And we want him back. He's ours. He belongs to us. We want him back.
Yes, we want him.
And we won't give up. We will not give up on bringing Mr. Wynn home. We may not bring him home tomorrow, but we won't give up on bringing Mr. Wynn home. He's been a model citizen. And it is difficult for us to believe that he would somehow become Mr. Hyde, metamorphosed from the Dr. Jekyll to a Mr. Hyde character, and do all of these things that are alleged. It's difficult for us to believe it. We just don't see that happening in the human being, generally speaking. Doesn't matter where you're from. Model citizens don't just wake up one morning and decide they're going to try to overthrow a government. Just doesn't happen. We want him back. And I want you to know this. I'm going to be with you until he returns. I thank you for allowing me to say a word to you and to others today. And if you have a response, I would yield the rest of my time.
Thank you, Congressman, for advocating for Michael and my family.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I know that the Foreign Ministry of Vietnam is watching. I hope they're listening. And I can't imagine that they could hear it with any greater emphasis or eloquence than we just heard from the gentleman from Texas. With that, Mr. Ben Cosme, I'd like to ask some questions about the Philippines. Duterte says that his extrajudicial killings are just drug dealers. And that, of course, would be bad enough because he will brand as a drug dealer anybody he wants to brand as a drug dealer. And oh, by the way to deal with drug dealers, even if they are drug dealers, is not through extrajudicial killing. But he's also killing people in indigenous groups. Can you describe the extrajudicial killings that are visited on these people?
Absolutely. It's part of a larger sort of crackdown that we're seeing against human rights defenders in the country. The way the Philippine government acts is that it red tags them, legitimate organizations, or brands them as things like communist fronts, which had led to an increase of harassment and attacks by unknown individuals against them. And so one of the stark findings is that that I mentioned in my oral statement is that even as of yesterday, we've heard of Karapatan members, human rights lawyers, who are being killed. Even as recently as this week. And so what we're seeing is Indigenous people who have an obligation under international human rights law to be defended, to have their universal human rights being violated by this government.
And we have the case of Maris Reza. Duterte will accuse almost anyone of being a drug dealer. He's accused her of speaking. Libel. One of the hallmarks of an anti-democratic government is when they criminalize speech. Libel here is only, in our law, is only a civil matter. I know some of the most prominent human rights lawyers in the world are focused on this case. This is the journalist who created the very popular news website Rappler. Can you tell us about the case, where it stands, and on what basis? I mean, how blatant is this as just an attack on the media?
There's no basis for any of the charges levied against Rappler and particularly Maria Ressa. I think up to at least 8 different charges have been placed on Maria Ressa. It's very clear that it is in part a retribution or reprisal because of the really fantastic investigative reporting that Rappler has done on Duterte's so-called war on drugs. And it's in part with a larger crackdown on free expression in the country.
Thank you, Ms. Wang. Focusing on Myanmar, today, as I understand it, there are still 500,000 Rohingya inside the borders of Burma, Myanmar, who have not yet fled. What can we do to assist and protect these people? And do you expect the government of Myanmar, Burma, to try to ethnically cleanse them as well?
Yeah, and I want to start by emphasizing the dire conditions that this 500,000 people live in. Just yesterday, I was reading reports that there are some credible assessments that show that on former Rohingya villages, the military is building bases. So if you want to talk about how systematic, planned, both looking into the past and looking to the future, this situation, the dire situation is, it's, as I mentioned earlier.
They're building bases on empty villages or on villages that are still inhabited?
Villages that have been razed by the military.
Gotcha. So first they use genocide and ethnic cleansing against the people, then they burn the village, and they build something where the village used to be.
Yeah, and in terms of how we can push for greater protections of these people, I think we spoke earlier about the need to increase access of various organizations to make sure that the aid is being provided according to international standards, and that's really important. And I think the main set of actions are around accountability and justice. So whether it's the State Department determination, increased sanctions, referral to the ICC, and I want to highlight, we haven't spoken at length about the advisory commission that was led by the late Kofi Annan, which came up with a very comprehensive plan about what needs to happen in Rakhine so that people can achieve.
I want to go to just one other question. That is,
Yeah.
I'm sure that the leadership of the Rohingya appreciates our efforts. They're far more significant than any other country in the world, far more significant than the Islamic Conference, which is over 20 countries. What could the Rohingya do, and what leader speaks for them that would be eloquent to explain to the Islamic Conference China's role in enabling this genocide?
You raise a really important point about the need for Rohingya to be given a platform, and examples like Mohib Ullah, who was invited to the Ministerial for Religious Freedom last week. That's a great example of someone who
I'm
is
sure that they will speak against Burma, Myanmar. I'm sure they'll speak for their people, but they won't have an effect, nor will they be suitably recognizing our efforts unless they point the finger at Beijing. And it's very convenient. I've had Muslim leaders tell me, don't talk about the Uyghurs. Pakistan needs that Chinese money. We don't want to talk about the Uyghurs. And then they go back and talk about how they're protecting Muslims around the world. What do we do to make sure that the Rohingya effectively communicate the enabling role of China?
I agree that the OIC can do more. They have taken some actions, but I think that what we've talked about in terms of a sustained international diplomatic campaign to continue pressing these messages are what's needed. And one last point on, we have also not heard President Trump make a statement on the Rohingya situation, the crisis, and that is something that shows that there is a gap between what we can do and what is being done currently.
Obviously, and I think Mr. Connolly was eloquent about how the president needs to speak more, and we would want all of our presidents to speak more about human rights, but I'll ask also Ms. Enos, is there anything that can be done in conjunction with the Rohingya leadership so that the Muslim world understands what China is doing here?
I've written before in a column that I write bi-monthly for Forbes that I think that there should be a formation of a coalition of the willing, led principally by the U.S., that includes Islamic voices in strongly issuing condemnations for what took place there. And I think we need to be frank about it. It was genocide. So.
With that, I'll recognize the ranking member for whatever questions he has for this, our second round.
Oh, I've got many questions, but I got a statement I have to make. I have to say something about Mr. Connolly. I appreciate his passion. I mean, it's very evident he didn't vote for this president. He doesn't like this president. But to accuse him of not standing up for human rights, I think is wrong. We don't know what was said in those meetings. You don't know what was said privately. He did not go to Vietnam to talk about human rights. It was about North Korea, and I think we need to keep that clear. I think this just clouds it, and this is part of the problem with Washington, D.C. It's a great political fight, and we can put it on TV for our next campaign ad, and that's stuff that makes me sick about this place. We have to have solutions to these problems, and it comes with policy. That's why I feel this committee is the most important committee on the Hill, because if our foreign policies are right, we have good national security, we have good trade, we have good economic policies. And until we come together on a common cause, you're going to see this circus. Mr. Sherman brought up a great point about if things like this happen in Vietnam, or as Mr. What was his last name from California District? Herrera. If his chief of staff is in Vietnam and they feel she got picked up because she was a chief of staff for a member of Congress, that is going to affect the future relationship of that country or any country that does the same thing with the United States of America. And we value our partnership with Vietnam now. I mean, they're a counter to China. They're our 17th largest trading partner. We disagree maybe on forms of government. We probably disagree on the human rights issue. I don't think they're totally void, but they're not going in the direction that we want to see. And this goes back to what I said previously. Our policies should be tiered. Tier 1, 2, 3 is what I propose. Tier 1 countries, we're 100% in alignment. They get the best trade deals. I would recommend free trade agreements. Tier 2, they don't get quite so good. Tier 3, very little. If you're below that, you don't trade with the United States or other like-minded countries. Until we change these things, you're going to have despotic leaders. Burma right now, last I think it was 2016, they're our 107th trading partner. We did almost over three-quarters of $1 billion in trade with them. This year already, we're almost at the end of May, we're about $500 million in trade with them. Biggest port is in California. So we're all against human rights abuses, but yet we keep trading because we don't want to lose the money. I think it's time we put our values above our pocketbook and send a signal to these countries. We're not excluding them from trade. We're just saying we have a higher standard, that if we put that standard, if they want to trade with the United States, a country that has the rule of law, that honors contracts, they come to our side without us saying you have to do these things. And I think that's been a misdirection of our foreign policy over the last 30 years. You have to do these things. They agree to it. We trade with them because it's written in a paper that we are doing these things, but we know darn well they're not doing them, but we keep trading them. But the paper says we're doing it, and they're supposed to, and then when it's brought to our attention, we're like, oh, well, son of a gun, please do better on your human rights. You brought up the rhetoric. One of you brought up the rhetoric. I think it was you brought up the rhetoric is spoken, but the actions aren't there. I think it's time we put the actions. If we truly believe in that, and of course some people say, well, that's an isolationist policy. Yeah, it could be. But I think it sends a strong message. You either do business with the people that believe in what you believe in, or stop doing business. I mean, we can go around the world and say all these despotic leaders, from Nicaragua to wherever. Anyways, my question is, you had brought up China's effect in Cambodia, China's effect in Burma. What are they doing that are suppressing the human rights? Is it their facial recognition and the CCTV cameras that are grading citizens and living out the 1984 George Orwell's book, where big government is watching?
I think one of the big concerns with China's Belt and Road Initiative is not only that they will export, various forms of investment, but that they will export authoritarianism on a whole. And I think one of the potential concerns of this, of course, is the use of the facial recognition technology and whatnot. I'm not aware of particular instances in either Cambodia or Burma where this technology has already been exported, but I think that the potential for that is extraordinarily strong. And I think that we should look at the case of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang as a foretaste of what could be to come, because there's a lot of incentives for bad actors like the Burmese military to misuse this technology for their own ends.
It really is, and that's where we're going. And my good colleague here, China, he had a good phrase, and I'm going to use it here, but China is offering their form of socialism with Chinese characteristics. But what it really comes down to is dictatorship with Chinese characteristics, because that's what's really being offered. So it gives these countries and their leaders the power to control their citizens so that they fall in line. They've given it to Maduro. That's why you've seen over 5 million people leave in Latin America. He's purging his country. He's going to have people that aren't willing to fight, or they believe in what he says, and the problem's solved for him. And it's a breakdown of democracies in the Western Hemisphere. But this is going on around the world, and the Asia-Pacific is probably the most significant area, because there's going to be more people living in that Asia-Pacific region by the year 2050 in the world than outside of that region. And so what kind of a future we want, and that's why we need to change our foreign policies to put us in a direction to get the results that we want, that we know empower the individual to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness on their terms. But you can't do that with a despotic regime. Mr. Chairman, thank you for allowing me to bloviate, I guess.
Always good to hear you. I'll point out that the jurisdiction of this subcommittee, South Asia, East Asia, and the Pacific, already has over half the population of the world. And I'll pose one question just for the record on Burma, Myanmar, and that is, I'd like people to review all the sanctions we had before Aung San Suu Kyi got back there, and opine on which should be reimposed now until such time as the Rohingya are given citizenship documents. These include GSP, a general ban on imports from Burma, the specific bans on jadeite and rubies and products containing those gemstones, ban on certain Burmese companies, the freezing of assets of certain nationals. We've done that to some degree. The prohibition of financial services to certain nationals, restrictions on investment, and especially restrictions on U.S. support for multilateral assistance. So take a look at what we were doing then and tell me which of those things we should do now. With that, I want to thank the witnesses. This hearing has been longer than most, but we've dealt with many important topics, and I especially want to thank Helen Wynn for being here. Thank you. We're done.